I was sitting at the head of my own Christmas dinner table, the candles lit, the turkey golden, my wine-colored shawl wrapped tight around my shoulders, when my daughter-in-law stood up, raised her glass, and announced to everyone that she'd canceled my credit card and taken control of my finances. For my own good. My son smiled like she'd just handed him the keys to my life. My sisters-in-law nodded in approval, and the whole room toasted to my humiliation like it was the best gift of the season. But as I looked across the table at their satisfied faces, I just smiled back, because they had. No idea I'd already signed the papers, hidden the deeds, and waited 3 months for this exact moment to prove who really held the power. Friends, before we dive into this story, I want to ask for a small favor. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to fight to be seen, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your country, your name. I read every single one of you, and your words keep these truths alive. I was slicing my 3rd helping of roasted squash when Lauren stood up, her champagne flute glinting under the soft glow of the cinnamon-scented candles I'd lit myself that morning. She cleared her throat, tapped the glass gently with a spoon, and suddenly the whole table went quiet, like someone had flipped a switch. The kids stopped chasing each other near the fireplace. My sisters stopped gossiping over green bean casserole. Even the Christmas carols streaming from the old stereo seemed to fade into the background. She stood there in that tight peach dress, belly rounded with my future grandchild, and smiled like this was the moment she'd been waiting for. "Starting today," she said, voice smooth as cream, "Daniel and I are taking over all financial decisions for the family, for Evelyn's protection." My fork froze midair. "Your credit card was canceled this morning," she added, turning to me with that practiced, pitying look. "You don't need to worry about bills or expenses anymore. Just let us know what you need, and we'll approve it." My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick right there on the embroidered tablecloth I'd stitched 30 years ago, the same one I used when Daniel was just a boy with milk on his chin and dreams in his eyes. I didn't move, didn't gasp, didn't cry. I just watched my son. Daniel's face lit up like he'd just been handed keys to a kingdom. He reached over and squeezed Lauren's hand like she'd performed some heroic act, like rescuing me from a life of reckless spending rather than stripping me of basic dignity in front of my entire family. I saw my sisters exchange approving glances. Sarah even gave a little nod, like this was overdue. Someone clinked their glass against Lauren's in a toast. Another murmured, "Finally." Someone stepping up. No one asked me how I felt. No one questioned whether this was true or fair or even legal. They just accepted it, because to them, I was already invisible. Just the sweet, helpless widow who forgot to pay the electric bill last winter, which wasn't true. I'd paid it 2 days early, or who probably didn't understand compound interest, as if I hadn't managed 3 businesses for decades. I chewed slowly, swallowing the bitterness along with the squash, and felt something harden inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a cold, steady awareness. I had let this happen. By staying quiet, by playing the humble old lady, I'd given them permission to believe I was harmless. And now, my own son had signed papers, probably over coffee, maybe even while I was dozing in my chair, agreeing to hand my life to someone who looked at me like I was a burden waiting to explode. Lauren sat back down like she'd just announced sunshine after a storm, smoothing her dress with smug satisfaction. Daniel leaned toward me, eyes shining with that earnest, misguided love. "It's for the best, Mom," he said softly, like I was a confused child who needed reassurance. "We're protecting you." Protecting me. From what? From the truth? From my own success? I almost laughed. If only he knew that while he was stressing over mortgage payments and overtime shifts, I'd been quietly collecting rent from 3 storefronts, watching property values rise, reinvesting every dollar like Mrs. Vanderbilt taught me back when I still used a rotary phone. But I said nothing, not then. I just nodded slowly, like I understood, like I was grateful. Inside, though, I was counting the months Lauren had been weaving these lies, counting the times Daniel had missed my calls because Ashley had plans, counting the nights I'd lain awake, wondering why my son suddenly flinched when I mentioned money. Now it made sense. She hadn't just married my son, she'd mapped out a takeover, and he'd handed her the blueprint with a smile. I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. The golden turkey sat untouched in the center of the table, steam long since vanished, just like my trust in the people I'd fed, housed, and loved for decades. My sisters were already deep in conversation about holiday sales and grandkids' school plays, as if nothing monumental had just happened, as if I hadn't just been publicly declared incompetent. I smoothed my sage green cardigan, the one I'd knitted during chemo stitch by stitch, while praying I'd live to see Daniel get married, and let my fingers brush the edge of my napkin. It was crisp, starched, perfect, just like everything else in this house. My house, bought with cash in 1998, after my first herbal soap sold out at the farmer's market, after I stayed up all night bottling elderberry syrup to afford Daniel's braces, after I said no to comfort so he could say yes to opportunity, and now, at 64, I was being treated like I couldn't be trusted to buy a tube of toothpaste. I looked at Lauren again. She was laughing at something Daniel said, head tilted, hand resting on her belly like a queen on a throne. She thought she'd won, that I'd crumble quietly, thank them for their kindness, and fade into the background like a worn-out rug. But I've never faded. I've only ever waited. Daniel touched my arm. "You okay, Mom?" His voice was gentle, but there was something else underneath. Relief. Like he'd been dreading this moment for weeks and was glad it was finally over. Like he expected me to argue, to cry, to make a scene. But I just gave him a small smile. "Of course, honey," I said. "It's just a lot to take in." He exhaled like I'd given him permission to relax. Lauren shot me a look, part challenge, part triumph. She wanted me to beg, wanted me to show weakness so she could play the gracious savior. But I've been broke, widowed, and sick, but never weak. Never that. I remembered the days after James died, when I sat on the floor of our empty kitchen with $50,000 in debt and a baby kicking in my belly, whispering promises to a child I hadn't even met yet. "You will never go without. You will never be small." And I kept those promises, every single one. Now, decades later, I looked at my son, the man I'd raised to be kind, honest, hard-working, and saw how easily he'd been turned against me. Not out of malice, but because he trusted the wrong person. And that hurt more than any insult, because I knew he believed he was doing the right thing, that he thought he was saving me from myself. I stood up slowly, chair scraping against the hardwood floor, just loud enough to draw every eye back to me. The room stilled again. Lauren's smile tightened. Daniel sat up straighter. I didn't raise my voice, didn't point a finger. Just looked my son right in those hazel eyes, the same eyes his father used to look at me with when we danced in the kitchen after paying off our first loan, and said, quiet as a winter wind, "Honey, you really don't know, do you?" His smile vanished. His hand dropped from Lauren's. For a second, the entire room held its breath. Lauren's glass stopped halfway to her lips. My sisters froze mid-bite. Even the fire seemed to hush. Daniel blinked, confusion flickering across his face like a warning light. "Know what, Mom?" he asked, voice suddenly small. I didn't answer. Not yet. I let the question hang in the air, thick with everything I hadn't said, everything they'd assumed, everything they'd stolen without asking, because the truth wasn't going to come out in a shouting match or a teary confession. It was going to unfold slowly, carefully, like untying a knot I'd tied myself decades ago. And by the time they understood what I'd built, while they thought I was barely surviving, it would be too late for them to take it back. I sat down again, picked up my water glass, and took a long, steady sip. The night was far from over, but something had shifted, and for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not the widow, not the old lady, but Evelyn Carter, the woman who never lost. Not really. I stood in line at Greenleaf Apothecary, clutching the small glass bottle I'd brought for a refill of my elderberry syrup, the same one I'd been using for winter immunity since Daniel was in elementary school. The store smelled like dried lavender and beeswax, familiar and safe. When my turn came, I handed over the bottle with a smile and slid my card into the reader like I had 100 times before. The machine beeped once, then flashed red. Transaction declined. I blinked. Tried again. Same result. The cashier, a girl I'd known since she was in pigtails, now with a nose ring and a name tag, that read Jenna, looked up at me with that careful, pitying expression people use when they think you're too old to understand. "Maybe try another card, Ms. Evelyn?" she said gently, like I'd forgotten how money worked. My face burned, but I just shook my head, mumbled something about "must be a glitch," and walked out with my empty bottle still in hand. The autumn wind bit my cheeks as I stepped onto the sidewalk, but it wasn't the cold that made my fingers tremble. It was the sudden, stomach-dropping certainty that this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And I knew exactly who was behind it. I didn't go home. I drove straight to First Valley Bank, the same branch where I'd opened my first savings account after James died. The lobby was quiet, just a few people waiting, soft piano music playing overhead like nothing in the world was wrong. I approached the teller, a young man, in a crisp blue shirt with a name tag that said Troy, and asked to speak with someone about my account. He led me to a small desk in the corner, where he pulled up my file with polite efficiency. Then he looked up, his voice lowered like he was delivering bad news. "Mrs. Carter, it looks like your son Daniel filed a petition for limited financial guardianship over you last week. He cited concerns about cognitive decline and potential vulnerability to financial scams." I stared at him. The words hung in the air like smoke. He also requested immediate suspension of your credit and debit cards as a protective measure. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. But my chest tightened like a vice. The same Daniel who I'd rocked through fevers, who I'd walked to the bus stop every morning until he was 10, who I'd stayed awake with for 3 straight nights when pneumonia nearly stole him from me. At 6, now believed I couldn't be trusted with my own money, that I was losing my mind. I almost laughed right there, hollow, bitter laughter, but I swallowed it down. Instead, I thanked Troy politely, stood up, and walked out like nothing had happened. But inside, something had snapped. The parking lot was nearly empty. I got into my car, shut the door, and just sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My breath came fast, shallow, not from fear, from fury, not at Daniel, not exactly, at Lauren. I could see her now, whispering in his ear, planting seeds of doubt. She forgot to pay the electric bill last month. Or, did you notice she repeated that story about Grandma's quilt 3 times? Lies, all of them. I paid every bill the day it arrived. I kept receipts in labeled folders. I remembered everything, especially the sacrifices I'd made so Daniel wouldn't have to. And now, they'd used my silence, my humility, my choice to live simply, as proof that I was slipping. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and dialed Thomas Green, my attorney since 1999. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn?" he said, his voice instantly alert. "Something's happened," I told him, and I laid it out fast. Card declined, bank visit, guardianship petition. He was silent for a beat, then said, "They filed it without your knowledge? Without a court hearing?" "Apparently they think a phone call is enough," I said, voice low. "Let me guess. They're claiming I'm senile." Thomas sighed. "I'll pull the filing right now. But Evelyn, you know what this means, don't you?" "Yes," I said. "It means they've made their move. Now it's my turn." I drove home slowly, the city blurring past my windshield. My hands were steady now. The shaking had passed, replaced by a cold, clear focus I hadn't felt in years. I thought about the LLCs I'd formed under quiet names, the deeds stored in my fireproof safe, the monthly rent deposits that hit accounts Daniel didn't even know existed. I'd built all of it in silence, not to hide from him, but to teach him. That worth isn't inherited, it's earned. But my lesson had backfired. My restraint looked like weakness. My privacy looked like poverty. And now, they were treating me like a child who needed saving. By them. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw the potted rosemary bush by the front step, dry from neglect. I hadn't watered it in days, too busy baking pies, polishing silver, pretending everything was fine. But not anymore. I walked inside, put the empty syrup bottle on the kitchen counter, and went straight to my bedroom. From under the false bottom of my jewelry box, a trick James taught me. During lean years, I pulled out a slim black notebook. Every property, every account, every legal detail was there, written in my own careful hand. I flipped to the page labeled Daniel Emergency Access. I hadn't updated it in 5 years. Today, I drew a single line through it. No more emergency. Access. No more pretending. I made tea, chamomile, the way I always did when my mind raced, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the wood grain. I thought about calling Daniel, confronting him, demanding an explanation, but I knew how that would go. He'd sound confused, hurt even. "Mom, we're just trying to help you. Lauren's worried. You've been forgetting things." He wouldn't see the betrayal. He'd see love, and that was the cruelest part. They weren't villains in their own story. They were heroes, rescuing poor, confused Evelyn from herself. But I wasn't confused. I was awake, and I remembered everything. The nights I'd bottle-fed him when he couldn't keep milk down, the way he'd clung to my cardigan when I dropped him at kindergarten, the pride in his voice when he told his friends, "My mom makes the best herbal soap in Oregon." That boy was still in there, but he was buried under Lauren's careful lies and his own desperate need to believe he was doing the right thing. I couldn't reach him with anger, not yet, but I could prepare. I picked up the phone again and called Thomas back. "Get the full guardianship." "Filing," I said, "and pull every document on my trusts, LLCs, and property titles. I want everything ready, not to fight them in court, but to show them what they've underestimated." He didn't ask why. He knew. Because sometimes the only language people understand is the truth, delivered without mercy. By dusk, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't beg, I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't play the helpless old lady they'd cast me as. If they wanted to treat me like I was fragile, I'd let them. Until the moment they realized the woman they'd tried to control had never needed their permission to exist. I went to the closet and took out my winter coat, the one with the deep pockets. In one, I slipped my phone. In the other, my notebook. Then I walked out to the garage, got into my car, and backed out of the driveway. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe the cafe downtown where Thomas and I always met, maybe just around the block to clear my head. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs, unraveling. And as I turned onto the main road, the setting sun warm on my face, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not fear, not even anger, but purpose. They'd struck the first blow, thinking I'd crumble, but they'd forgotten. I'd built this family's stability from nothing, and I still had the blueprint. I poured the chamomile tea carefully, watching the steam curl upward as the late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn oak table, the same one I'd sanded and refinished myself after James died. I'd baked lemon scones that morning, the way Daniel liked. Them when he was a boy, soft in the center with just enough sugar on top to catch the light. He arrived right on time, shoulders tense, eyes wary, like he half expected me to yell or cry or both. I didn't. I just smiled, pulled out his favorite chair, the one with the slightly wobbly leg he'd tried to fix with duct tape when he was 12, and said, "I thought we could talk. Just you and me." He sat, fidgeting with his wedding ring, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks, and the words started pouring out, about how worried he'd been, how Lauren had found things that scared her, how they only wanted what was best for me. I let him go. I stirred my tea slowly, watching his face shift from guilt to concern to something that looked almost like pity. He leaned forward, voice low and earnest. Mom, I didn't want to believe it at first, but Lauren showed me screenshots, emails from the electric company saying your bill was late, a letter from the pharmacy about missed pickups for your blood pressure meds. He paused, searching my eyes. And then there was this thing about you sending $200 to some guy in Nevada through one of those online apps. Said he was a veteran in need. Mom, do you even remember doing that? I didn't flinch. I hadn't missed a single bill in 20 years. I paid everything the same day it arrived, always in full, always on time. The pharmacy? I'd been using the same one since Daniel was in diapers. And I picked up every prescription myself. And the veteran? Total fiction. I'd never sent money to anyone online in my life. But instead of arguing, I just asked quietly, "And you believed her without asking me?" He looked down, guilt flashing across his face. "It's not that I didn't trust you. Mom, it's just, Lauren said you've been forgetting things lately, repeating stories, mixing up dates. She showed me notes she'd taken, things you supposedly said that didn't line up." My chest tightened. Those notes were traps. Carefully planted misunderstandings turned into evidence. And my own. Son, the boy who once ran home crying because he thought I'd be mad he broke a vase, now sat across from me, convinced I was slipping away without even realizing it. What cut deepest wasn't the accusation. It was the certainty in his voice. He truly thought he was saving me, not controlling me, not humiliating me, saving me. He talked about how relieved he felt after they froze my cards, how clean it felt to take over the financial stress, how Lauren had promised to monitor things closely so nothing bad happens. I watched his hands, strong, capable hands that used to build model airplanes, with me on rainy Sundays, and realized he'd been groomed to see me as fragile, not wise, not resilient, just old. And it wasn't malice. That's what made it so painful. He loved me. He thought he was doing the right thing. And that love, twisted by someone else's manipulation, had become the very weapon used to strip me of my dignity. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him see how Lauren had turned his care into chains. But I stayed quiet, because if I lashed out, he'd only retreat further into her version of reality. So I nodded slowly, took a bite of scone, dry in my mouth, and whispered, "I understand you were trying to protect me." He reached across the table then, covering my hand with his. "I know this feels hard, Mom, but it's temporary, just until we're sure you're steady again." His touch was warm, familiar, and it almost undid me. Almost. Because beneath that, warmth was a current of something colder, the assumption that I was broken, that I needed fixing, that my judgment, after raising him alone, after surviving cancer, after quietly building businesses while he slept in the next room, was no longer trustworthy. I thought about telling him about the rental properties, the LLCs, the trust fund I'd grown grain by grain like wheat in a field. But I didn't. Not yet. Because this wasn't about money. It was about trust. And right now, that trust was gone. Not because I'd lost it, but because someone had poisoned it while I wasn't looking. So I just squeezed his hand back and said, "Thank you for caring, Daniel." And for a moment, he looked like the boy I remembered, soft eyes, hopeful smile, before the weight of Lauren's narrative settled back onto his shoulders. When he left, I walked him to the door, hugged him like I always did, and watched. His car disappeared down the street. Then I went back inside, closed the door softly, and stood in the quiet kitchen. The tea was cold. The scones sat untouched. I picked up my cup, set it down again. My hands were steady, but my breath came fast, shallow, like I'd been running. I sat at the table, the same place where I'd changed his diapers, helped with homework, bandaged scraped knees, and finally let it out. A sob, raw and ugly, tearing from somewhere deep I hadn't opened in years. I cried, not because they'd lied about my bills or my memory. I cried because the man who'd once clung to my leg at daycare, who whispered, "I love you, Mom," every night before bed, now looked at me like I was a stranger he needed to manage. He didn't see me. Not really. And that was the real betrayal. Not the canceled card, not the guardianship paperwork, but the quiet erasure of who I'd always been in his eyes. For the first time since James died, I felt truly alone. Not because I was abandoned, but because the person who knew me best had been taught to doubt the truth of my own life. I stayed at the table until the sun dipped below the trees and the kitchen filled with shadows. I didn't wipe my face. Let the tears dry on my cheeks. Let the ache settle in my bones. Because grief like this needed to be felt, not fixed. And when it finally passed, I stood up, washed the teacups, wrapped the scones in foil, and put them in the freezer, just in case Daniel came back. Then I went to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, and pulled out the notebook where I kept everything: account numbers, property deeds, business filings. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Truth doesn't need proof until someone decides to lie for you." I didn't know what I'd do next, but I knew one thing. For certain, I wouldn't fight to prove I was competent. I'd fight to prove I was seen. And if that meant shattering their comfortable illusion, then so be it. My son might have forgotten who I was, but I hadn't. And that was enough, for now. I sat on the edge of my bed long after midnight, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of old floorboards settling. My hands shook, not from fear, but from that low, simmering anger that only betrayal can stir. I reached under the bed, fingers brushing dust and forgotten shoeboxes until they found the smooth edge of the cedarwood box I hadn't opened since James's anniversary 5 years ago. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. Inside, on a bed of faded blue fabric, lay his wedding band, thin, gold, worn smooth by decades of honest work, and beneath it, a crumpled $20 bill, folded so many times the creases were nearly torn through. That was all I had after my first farmer's market in '99. Lavender soap, handmade labels, trembling hands, and hope thinner than the morning mist. I held the bill now like a relic. It wasn't about the money. It was about the woman who earned it, who stayed up until 3 a.m. bottling elderberry syrup, who sold everything she owned to pay off James's medical debts, who walked 3 miles in the rain just to deliver one order because she'd promised it by noon. That woman didn't beg. She built. And somewhere along the way, I let everyone, including my own son, forget she ever existed. I carried the box to the kitchen table, where the overhead light cast hard shadows across the grain. I spread out old receipts, a yellowed photo of my first apothecary shelf, and the deed to my first rental property, bought in 2007 under Whitethorn Holdings, an LLC no one in my family had ever heard of. I remembered the nights Daniel was just weeks old, swaddled in a bassinet at my feet while I filled dropper bottles by candlelight, my back aching, my eyes burning, but my hands never stopping. Every jar labeled by hand, every dollar reinvested. I paid off my last loan in 2012, the same week Daniel turned 16 and asked for a new bike. I told him we'd have to wait. He didn't complain. He got a weekend job at the gas station. That's the kind of boy he was. That's the kind of man I wanted him to become. Grounded, real, not spoiled by wealth he didn't earn. So I stayed quiet. I wore thrift store sweaters. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. I let him believe I struggled because I thought that struggle would make him strong. But now, that same silence had become the very proof Lauren used to. Paint me as helpless, forgetful, even delusional. They didn't see the empire. They saw the costume. And I realized with a sharp, gut-wrenching clarity, I'd hidden so well that I'd disappeared. I poured myself a glass of water, my throat tight, and stared at the documents fanned out before me like evidence at a trial. It wasn't shame I felt. It was grief. Grief for the years I spent pretending, for the pride I mistook for protection, for the truth I withheld, thinking it was love. Daniel never knew I paid his college tuition in full, that I bought the textbooks he claimed were on sale, that I quietly covered his car insurance when he lost his first job. I let him believe he was doing it all on his own. And in many ways, he was. He worked hard, stayed humble, never threw money around. But what he didn't know was that his foundation was steadier than he thought, and that steadiness came from me. Now Lauren had twisted that humility into vulnerability, and Daniel, my sweet, trusting boy, had swallowed it whole. He didn't question her stories about missed bills or forgotten appointments because he believed I was just scraping by. And why wouldn't he? I gave him every reason to think to. So, the irony was almost cruel. I sacrificed honesty to teach him integrity, and in doing so, I handed someone else the tools to dismantle my credibility. My hands clenched around the glass. No more. Not after this. I went to the hall closet and pulled out my old fireproof safe, the one hidden behind. Winter coats and forgotten scarves. Inside were the keys to the storage unit that held business licenses, tax returns, and bank statements going back 20 years. I also kept a slim black ledger there, every entry in my own handwriting: property purchases, rent deposits, LLC renewals, profit, margins. I'd built this life one quiet transaction at a time, not for fame or power, but because I refused to be erased by widowhood, poverty, or pity. But now, that discretion had backfired. My choice to stay small in front of others had made me invisible when it mattered most. And invisibility, I realized, isn't humility, it's surrender. I sat on the living room floor with the ledger open on my lap, the numbers glowing under the lamp. This wasn't just about money, it was about truth. And if my own son couldn't see who I really was, then maybe it was time I stopped hiding. Not to boast, not to punish, but to reclaim the dignity I'd handed away piece by piece in the name of love. I thought about calling Daniel right then, telling him everything, but I knew how it would go. He'd be stunned, confused, maybe even hurt that I'd kept so much from him, and Lauren would spin it as manipulation, as a desperate bid for control. No, this truth needed to land like a stone in still water, clear, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. So I made a list instead. On the back of an old envelope, I wrote down everything: properties, accounts, LLC names, monthly income streams. Not to impress, but to prove that I wasn't slipping, that I wasn't helpless, that I had never been the fragile, fading figure they'd turned me into at that dinner table. My mind was sharp, my memory precise, my judgment sound, and if they were going to strip me of my autonomy based on lies, then they'd learn the hard way that the woman they underestimated had been writing the real story all along, just not out loud. I folded the list and tucked it into my wallet, not as a threat, but as a promise to myself. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't apologize for my silence anymore. I wouldn't justify my privacy, but I also wouldn't let it be used against me. If dignity was the price of secrecy, then secrecy had to end. I closed the cedar box gently and placed it back under the bed, but this time, I left the ledger out on the kitchen table, open to the page listing Whitethorn Holdings total. Assets. Let them see it when the time came. Let them understand that the poor widow they pitied was the architect of a life they couldn't even imagine. And most of all, let Daniel finally meet the woman who'd loved him enough to disappear, so he could love her again, not for what she gave him, but for who she truly was. No more secrets, not if they cost me myself. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the Willow and Bean, the bell above jingling softly like it had 100 times before, back when I was just Amelia with a notebook full of sketches and a heart full of fear. The cafe smelled the same: dark roast, vanilla, and the faint tang of old books from the shelf by the window. Thomas was already there, sitting in our usual corner booth, steaming mug in front of him, a worn leather briefcase on the seat beside him like a silent bodyguard. He stood when he saw me, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. Thomas had been my attorney since 1999, and he knew, better than anyone, what silence could cost. "You look tired," he said, not as a question, but as fact. I slid into the booth across from him, my coat still damp from the drizzle outside. "I am," I said, "but not powerless." He nodded once, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, Manila folder, its edges frayed from use. He slid it across the table without a word. The moment my fingers touched it, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope, not yet, but the first breath after being underwater too long. I opened the folder slowly. On top was the deed to the Bend Apothecary, the one I'd bought cash in 2008, the one Daniel thought was just a vacation cabin. Beneath it, trust agreements, LLC registrations, property tax records, bank statements with balances that would make Lauren choke on her champagne. Every single document bore my name, dated, notarized, filed. "You've been operating under the radar for 20 years, Thomas said quietly, stirring his coffee. But legally, everything's airtight. No loopholes, no vulnerabilities. Lauren might think she's playing chess, but she doesn't even know the board exists." I ran my thumb over the embossed seal on a corporate charter I'd signed in 2011, the year Daniel graduated college. I'd paid every tuition bill myself, in full, while letting him believe it was scholarships and part-time jobs. I did it to teach him grit, not greed, but now that same silence had been twisted into proof of decline. Thomas leaned forward. "She filed for guardianship based on cognitive concerns, but there's no medical evaluation, no court order. Daniel signed a power of attorney under emotional persuasion, not legal necessity. That's fragile, and fragile breaks." We spent the next hour drafting a counter-strategy, not in loud declarations, but in precise, quiet moves. Thomas laid it out like blueprints. I wouldn't confront them yet. I'd let Lauren believe she'd won, let her strut around like she owned my life. In the meantime, I'd quietly activate dormant accounts, reassign management of my rental properties to trusted tenants, and prepare a full disclosure packet, not just for Daniel, but for the whole family. "The real blow," Thomas said, tapping the folder, "isn't that you're rich. It's that Daniel was used. She didn't just lie about your finances. She manipulated him into betraying you, thinking he was protecting you. That hit harder than any insult. My son, kind and earnest, weaponized without his knowledge." I pictured his face at the table, so proud of Lauren's announcement, so certain he was doing the right thing. The pain wasn't in the theft. It was in the theft disguised as love. "They need to see the architecture of the lie," I said. "Not just the bricks, but who laid them." Outside, rain began to fall in earnest, streaking the cafe windows and turning the sidewalk into a mirror of passing headlights. I watched a young woman hurry by, holding a baby carrier in one hand and an umbrella in the other, and for a second I saw myself, exhausted, determined, building a world no one could see. Thomas pushed a fresh cup of tea toward me. "You don't have to do this all at once," he said gently. But I did. Every day I stayed quiet was another day they believed their version of me. Fragile, forgetful, finished. "I'll invite them to dinner," I said, more to myself than to him. "Christmas Eve, same table, same candles. I'll let Lauren make her toast. Then I'll bring you in." He didn't flinch, just nodded. "I'll be ready." We finalized the timeline, 2 weeks to gather updated documents, 1 week to verify asset statuses, 3 days to rehearse the delivery. Not for drama, for clarity. This wasn't about shaming Lauren. It was about freeing Daniel from the story she'd written for him. When the folder was closed, I felt lighter. Not because the anger was gone, it wasn't, but because it, now, had direction, purpose. I hadn't built everything I had by waiting for permission, and I wouldn't lose it by pretending to be small when it mattered most. Thomas placed a hand briefly over mine. Just a second, but it carried decades of loyalty. "You've always been sharper than they gave you credit for," he said. I almost smiled. They never looked closely enough. We paid our tabs in silence. As I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass, gray hair pulled back, wool coat, eyes tired but steady. Not the woman they thought I was. Not the widow they pitied. The woman who knew the difference between hiding and choosing when to be seen. I thanked Thomas at the door. He tipped his hat, old habit, and walked off toward his office. I turned the other way, toward my car, past the glowing storefronts and wet pavement, my steps firmer than they'd been in months. As I drove home, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windshield, I didn't feel vengeful. Vengeance is messy, hot, and loud. What I felt was clear, cool, sharp, and absolute. Like the moment you realize a storm isn't coming. It's already passed, and you're still standing. For the first time since that. Thanksgiving dinner, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. I wasn't defending. I was revealing. And in that clarity, I found something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Control. Not the kind that demands obedience, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and never letting anyone convince you otherwise. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't rush inside. I sat in the quiet for a moment, engine off, hands on the wheel, and just breathed. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and this time I wouldn't disappear. I'd show up, fully, fiercely, and finally on my own terms. Lauren called me on a Tuesday afternoon, just after I'd finished watering the rosemary bush by the front step. Her voice was syrupy, slow, like she was talking to a child who needed reassurance. "Mom," she began, "Daniel and I've been talking, and we're really worried about you living all alone in that big house. It's just not safe." I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence stretch, watching a sparrow hop across the driveway, its tiny head jerking with every step. "We think it's time you moved in with us," she continued, her tone shifting just slightly. Less concern, more finality. "The guest room's already set up. You'd be so much more comfortable, and we could keep an eye on you." I almost laughed. Keep an eye on me? Like I was a ticking bomb waiting to go off. But then I thought about the way Daniel had looked at me at Thanksgiving. Proud, relieved, like he'd finally solved the Evelyn problem. And I realized, if I refused, they'd only push harder, invent new reasons, dig deeper into their story of my fragility. So I took a breath, softened my voice, and said, "You're right, Lauren. Maybe it is time." Her pause was so slight, but I caught it, the beat of stunned silence before she recovered. "Oh, that's wonderful," she chirped, her relief almost audible. "We'll come get you this weekend." I hung up, set the watering can down, and went inside. I didn't pack much, just enough to play the part. 3 days later, I rolled my small suitcase up the driveway of Daniel and Lauren's new house, a 2-story modern thing with oversized windows and a manicured lawn that screamed, "We made it." Lauren greeted me at the door in tailored yoga pants and a silk blouse, her hand resting on her rounded belly like a trophy. "Welcome home, Mom," she said, and hugged me. Stiffly, like I was a guest at a business meeting, not her mother-in-law. Daniel helped me inside, beaming like this was some noble act of charity. "You'll love it here," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "We've got everything set up for you." The guest room was neat, sterile, a twin bed, a lamp, a framed print of seashells on the wall. No photos of me, no personal touches, just a space to contain me. I smiled, nodded, thanked them both, played the grateful widow, the humble old lady who'd finally accepted her place. Inside, though, I was already watching, listening, calculating. I'd left my real valuables at home, my documents, my jewelry, my notebook, but I'd brought my phone, my charger, and the one thing Lauren didn't know about, my reactivated credit card. I'd called the bank the morning after Thanksgiving and quietly reversed the cancellation, setting up alerts for every transaction. Now I slipped it into the side pocket of my suitcase, hidden beneath a folded sweater, and waited. The first night, I sat by the window after they thought I'd gone to bed. The guest room overlooked the backyard, but through a gap in the blinds, I could see the glow of their bedroom, light, and hear snippets of conversation when they left their own window open. Around 11 p.m., I heard Lauren's voice, low and smug. "She actually said yes. Can you believe it? Like she just gave up." Daniel chuckled. "She's finally seeing sense. I was worried she'd fight us." "Oh, she's grateful," Lauren said, and I could picture her smirking. She even hugged me, said she felt safe here. My stomach turned, but I stayed still. Then came the real gift. A few days later, I got a notification on my phone. $875 charge at Neiman Marcus. I didn't react in front of them. But that afternoon, while Lauren was on a video call in her home office, I browsed the store's website on my phone, same day, same location, scrolled through recent purchases, and there they were, buttery soft leather ankle boots in chestnut brown, size 8. The kind she'd eyed for months but claimed were too indulgent. Now, she'd bought them on my card, thinking it was inactive, thinking I was powerless. I closed the browser, took a slow breath, and went to make tea. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I felt something colder, sharper, clarity. She wasn't just controlling me, she was stealing from me, and she didn't even know I could see. That evening, over grilled salmon and asparagus, Lauren turned to me with that practiced warmth. "You seem so much more relaxed here, Mom. Like a weight's off your shoulders." I stirred my tea slowly, gave her a small, tired smile. "It helps knowing I'm not a burden anymore." Daniel beamed. "See? This was the right call." Later, while I was putting away laundry in my room, I heard them in the kitchen, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "So grateful," Lauren was saying. "She finally understands her place." The words landed like stones in my gut. Not her home, not her family, her place. As if I were furniture, rearranged for their convenience. I stood by the window again that night, watching the moon cast long shadows across their perfect yard. I thought about the years I'd spent teaching Daniel to be kind, to work hard, to respect others, only to watch him hand my life over to someone who saw me as a problem to manage. And yet, as painful as it was, I felt no urge to argue, to cry, to beg for respect, because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment before the reckoning. They believed I'd surrendered, but I'd only stepped onto their stage to witness their last act. I barely slept that night, not from fear, but from focus. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the upstairs floor, the distant wail of a siren, felt loaded with meaning. I lay in that narrow bed, eyes open, counting the hours. 1 week until Christmas Eve. 1 week until Thomas arrived with the folder. 1 week until they looked across the dinner table and saw not the meek old woman they'd boxed in, but the woman who'd built an empire in silence. I thought about the boots, the card, the smug way. Lauren said, her place. She didn't realize that by treating me like a ghost in my own life, she'd lit the fuse. And I wasn't going to haunt them. I was going to wake them up. I got up at 3 a.m., walked quietly to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. The house was cold, quiet. I stood in the dark, listening to their even breathing from the master bedroom. They felt safe, in control, and that was exactly how I wanted them. Comfortable in their lie right up until the moment it collapsed. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too hot, too messy. What I felt was resolve, calm, absolute, and unshakable. I'd let them believe they'd won. Now, I'd let them discover how wrong they were. By morning, I'd made my peace with the role I had to play. At breakfast, I asked Lauren if I could help with laundry. She looked surprised, then pleased. "Oh, Mom, you don't have to." "I want to," I said, gently. "It makes me feel useful." She smiled, patted my hand. "You're such a sweetheart." I folded Daniel's shirts, matched socks, even ironed a blouse of hers, tiny acts of submission that fed their illusion. But inside, I was already rehearsing my lines for Christmas Eve. I pictured Lauren's face. When Thomas laid out the deeds, the bank statements, the proof that the struggling widow she'd dismissed owned more than she'd ever touch. I imagined Daniel's shock, his dawning horror as he realized his wife had not only lied about me, but manipulated him into betraying the one person who'd always put him first. That night, I didn't sleep again. Not because I was afraid, but because I was counting the hours, the minutes, the breaths between now and the moment everything changed. The truth was coming, and this time, it wouldn't whisper. It would roar. The table was set just like last Thanksgiving. Same embroidered cloth I'd stitched decades ago, same cinnamon candles, same golden turkey in the center. But this time, I wasn't alone. Thomas sat beside me in his gray wool coat, hands folded on his lap, calm as stone. I'd picked him up an hour earlier, and we hadn't said much on the drive over. He didn't need to. He knew what tonight was, not revenge, but reckoning. The house buzzed with chatter, Lauren's sister laughing too loud, Daniel's cousins debating football, children running between rooms with crinkled wrapping paper trailing behind them. And there at the head of the table, Lauren glowed in a deep red maternity dress, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding a flute of cider like a scepter. She caught my eye and smiled, that same smug, satisfied smile she'd worn the night she took my card. She thought tonight was her victory. Lap. She had no idea it was her last performance. When the laughter quieted, she stood, tapped her glass, and said, "Family, before we dig in, I want to toast to our new beginning, to unity, responsibility, and the future we're building together." Her gaze flicked to me, warm as ice, and to Mom, for finally letting us take care of her. My stomach tightened, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I pushed my chair back and stood. "Before you celebrate," I said, voice steady, clear enough to cut through the holiday music playing softly in the background, "I'd like you all to meet my attorney, Thomas." "Green!" The room went still. Lauren's hand froze halfway to her lips. Daniel turned slowly, confusion knitting his brow. Thomas stood without drama, nodded politely, and opened his leather briefcase. He didn't shout. He didn't smirk. He just laid the truth on the table. Literally. First came the deed to the Bend Apothecary, then the lease for the Portland location, then the Ashland property. One by one, he placed them in front of everyone. Rental agreements with clean signatures, trust statements showing consistent deposits, LLC registrations, tax filings, all in my name, all dated, all legal, someone gasped. I didn't look to see who. My eyes were locked on Lauren. Her face had gone slack, her mouth slightly open, like she'd just been slapped with silence. Daniel reached out and picked up a page, his hands shaking. "Mom, what is this?" he whispered. I didn't answer him yet. I turned to Lauren, voice low but sharp as a needle. "You told him I was broke. You told him I couldn't manage my own money, that I was slipping." I stepped closer, just enough so only she could hear the next part. "But the truth is, I own more than you'll ever see in 10 lifetimes." Lauren tried to recover fast. She straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and let out a brittle laugh. "This is ridiculous. Some papers don't prove anything. She's just trying to save face." But her voice wavered, and her eyes darted to Daniel like she was recalculating every lie she'd told him. Thomas didn't flinch. Actually, Mrs. Carter's net worth exceeds $7 million, most of it in real estate and passive income, all fully documented, fully taxed, fully hers. The words landed like stones in still water. Daniel dropped the papers like they'd burned him. His face went pale, bone white. He looked from me to Lauren, then back to the documents, like he was trying to solve a puzzle where all the pieces had just flipped over. "You knew?" he asked her, voice cracking. "Did you know she had all this?" Lauren shook her head frantically. "No, of course not. She never said a word." "Because I didn't have to," I interrupted. "I didn't owe you an explanation. I lived simply by choice, not by necessity. And you used that choice as proof I was helpless." Daniel's breathing got shallow. He gripped the edge of the table like he might fall. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" The pain in his voice was real, raw, because he finally saw it. He hadn't been protecting me. He'd been used. And worse, he'd done it willingly. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, watching the truth sink in. Lauren started talking fast, trying to spin it. "She's manipulating you, Daniel. This is a setup." But her words sounded hollow now, like a recording played too many times. Thomas calmly pulled out one more document, a summary sheet with bold headings. Total monthly income, asset valuation, trust beneficiaries. He slid it toward Daniel. "Your mother has quietly supported you your whole life. Paid your tuition, bought your first car, covered your insurance when you lost your job. She never told you because she wanted you to earn your own way. Not because she was broke, but because she believed in you." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years, not as a fragile old lady, but as the woman who'd built a life from nothing while he slept in the next room. And in that look, I saw something break open. Not just betrayal, but understanding. He turned to Lauren, voice trembling. "You told me she forgot to pay her bills, that she gave money to strangers online, that she was confused." Lauren opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face crumpled, not with remorse, but with panic. She knew the game was over. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then Daniel stood up, slow and unsteady, like a man waking from a dream he never wanted to leave. He didn't look at Lauren. He looked at me. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Those 3 words hit harder than any of her lies ever did, because I knew he meant it. He hadn't been cruel. He'd been blind, and now he could see. Lauren finally found her voice, shrill and desperate. "This changes nothing. She still canceled her card. She still needed help." "No," Daniel cut in, turning to her now, his voice firm for the first time. "You made her look weak so you could look strong. You lied to me. About everything." Lauren's eyes widened. She reached for his arm, but he stepped back. The room watched in stunned silence. I didn't enjoy their discomfort. I didn't need their applause. What I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was clarity. For years, I'd hidden my strength to teach my son humility. But humility shouldn't cost you your dignity. And tonight, I got it back. Not by shouting, not by begging, just by standing in the truth, unapologetic and whole. I didn't stay for dessert. After Thomas packed the documents and the tension in the room became too thick to breathe, I thanked everyone for coming and said I'd be leaving. Daniel walked me to the door, his face streaked with quiet tears. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, voice raw. "You don't have to fix it tonight," I told him, touching his cheek the way I did when he was small. "Just don't look away again." He nodded, gripping my hand like he might lose me if he let go. Thomas waited by the car, silent, respectful. As I got in, I glanced back at the house, lit up with Christmas lights, full of people who thought they knew me, who'd celebrated my erasure just hours before. But I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. For the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, I didn't feel shame. I felt power. Not the kind that comes from money or control, but the kind that comes from being seen for who you really are, even when it terrifies the people who built their world on your silence. And as we drove away into the cold December night, I knew one thing for certain: the story wasn't over, but I was finally writing my own lines. The moment Thomas finished laying out the final trust statement, Lauren shot to her feet like she'd been scalded. Her face was flushed, eyes wild, but she wasn't backing down. "This is a scam," she snapped, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "She's hiding money from the IRS. You think I haven't seen how she lives? She's been cooking the books for years." She turned to Daniel, pleading now. "Babe, you have to see this. It's a setup. She's been manipulating you just like I warned you." But before Daniel could even open his mouth, Thomas calmly leaned forward, opened a slim folder I hadn't seen before, and slid 2 pages across the table. "Mrs. Lauren," he said, voice as steady as a metronome, "Mrs. Carter has filed every tax return for the last 23 years, all income reported, all deductions documented. The IRS has never questioned a single line item. In fact, she overpaid last year and received a refund." He tapped the documents. "Here's the audit history. Clean, every dollar accounted for." Lauren's mouth opened, then closed. The fight drained out of her posture, but only for a second. Then she squared her shoulders. "Okay, fine. But what about all this property? Why? Didn't she tell Daniel? Why keep it secret if she's so honest?" That's when Thomas looked her dead in the eye and said, "Because she didn't have to. But maybe the real question is, why did you take out a $40,000 loan in your husband's name 3 months ago without his knowledge?" The room went ice cold. Daniel froze mid-reach for his water glass. "What?" he said, voice barely above a whisper. Lauren's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about." But Thomas didn't blink. "Loan number 7482B, filed with First Valley Credit Union. Purpose listed as family emergency. Signed. With Daniel's electronic signature. Forged, by the way. The bank flagged it for review last week when they noticed unusual activity on his credit. They reached out to me because Mrs. Carter is a long-standing client." He turned to Daniel. "You never authorized it. You never even knew it existed." Daniel slowly turned to Lauren. His hands were shaking. "Is that true?" She started talking fast, voice cracking. "It was for the baby, for the nursery, the medical bills. We were behind, Daniel, you know that. I just didn't want to stress you." "You forged my signature," he said, flat and quiet. "You took out a loan in my name and didn't tell me." "It was for us," she cried, tears spilling over. "Everything I've done has been to protect our family." But the lie was naked now, stripped bare in front of everyone. Even her own sisters-in-law looked away. Daniel stood up so suddenly, his chair scraped loud against the hardwood. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just stared at her like he was seeing a stranger for the first time. "You told me Mom couldn't handle her own money," he said, voice raw. "You showed me fake emails about missed bills. You said she was forgetting things. You made me believe she was falling apart." He took a step closer. "And all this time, you were the one stealing. From me, from her, from our future." Lauren reached for his arm, but he pulled back like her touch burned. "Daniel, please, don't," he cut her off. "Just don't." He ran a hand over his face, shoulders slumping like the weight of the last year had finally crushed him. "You lied about everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. She started sobbing then, not the elegant tears she'd practiced for sympathy, but ugly, desperate gasps. "It's her fault," she screamed. "She," pointing at me, "she manipulated you. She set this up. She wanted to ruin us." But no one moved. No one defended her. Even her own family sat silent, eyes wide with shame. The spell was broken. The story she'd woven so carefully, of me as the fragile old lady, of herself as the capable savior, had unraveled in minutes. And what was left wasn't a hero, just a woman who'd gambled with my son's trust and lost. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth had done the work. Thomas quietly packed his documents while Daniel walked to the fireplace and leaned his forehead against the mantel. Back, turned to all of us. His shoulders hitched once, softly, like he was holding back something too big to show. Lauren kept crying, muttering about how unfair this was, how no one understood the pressure she was under, how I'd poisoned Daniel against her. But her words had no power anymore. They just echoed in the silence like smoke with no fire left to feed them. After a while, she stopped, wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood up. "Fine," she said, voice brittle. "If that's how you see me, then I'm not staying here." She turned to Daniel, waiting, maybe for him to stop her, to pull her back, to say it was all a misunderstanding. But he didn't move, didn't even look at her. She swallowed hard, then walked out of the dining room without another word. A few minutes later, I heard the bedroom door close upstairs, then the sound of drawers opening, zippers, hurried footsteps. She was packing. By midnight, her suitcase was by the front door. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, no makeup, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked younger, smaller, like the armor had finally cracked, and what was underneath was just tired. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. I stood in the hallway, watching. She approached him slowly. "Daniel," she said, voice trembling. "Say something." He looked up at her, eyes red-rimmed but clear. "You took everything I trusted you with," he said, "and used it against the one person who never asked for anything. In return," she flinched like he'd slapped her. "I thought I was protecting us," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "That's what scares me the most," he said, "that you really believed that." She nodded, tears falling again, and picked up her suitcase. I walked her to the door, not out of kindness, but because I needed to see it through to the end. She got into her car without looking back. Before she closed the door, she paused. "This isn't over," she said, not to me, but to the night. Then she slammed it shut and drove off, tires crunching on the gravel. I stood on the porch for a long time, arms crossed against the cold, watching her taillights disappear down the street. I didn't feel triumph. No swelling music in my chest, no sense of victory. What I felt was relief. Deep, bone-weary relief, like I could finally take a full breath after holding it for months. But beneath that was something heavier. Sadness. Not for Lauren. For Daniel. My son. The boy who'd once run upstairs to tell me about his first crush, who'd held my hand at his father's funeral, who'd promised me on his 18th birthday that he'd always take care of me, had been twisted into doubting the truth of my love. He'd been used like a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. And the worst part? He hadn't done it out of malice. He'd done it because he trusted the wrong person with his whole heart. As I walked back inside, I found him still at the table, head in his hands. I didn't say anything. I just sat beside him, put my hand over his, and waited. After a while, he turned to me, eyes wet. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered. And in that moment, I knew the real work was just beginning. Not to rebuild what was broken, but to help him heal from the lie that had almost cost him everything. The rain tapped softly against the kitchen window as I set 2 mugs on the table. Black coffee for him, chamomile for me. Daniel sat in his usual spot, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow like he hadn't slept in days. He hadn't, not really. He'd been staying in the guest room at his own house until Lauren stormed out, then showed up at my door with a duffel bag and that lost look I hadn't seen since he was 12, and came home with a broken bike. I didn't ask questions, just made space. For 2 weeks, he slept in his old room, the one with the faded baseball posters still taped to the wall, the bedspread I'd sewn when he was in high school. Mornings were quiet. We'd sip coffee while the world outside blurred into gray watercolor. Sometimes he'd stare into his cup like it held answers. Other times, he'd just watch me move around the kitchen as if making sure I was real. On the 5th morning, he finally spoke. "Did you know she was lying about the bills? About my credit?" I nodded. I saw the bank alerts. I knew the moment she used my card. He winced. "Why didn't you stop her sooner?" I didn't answer right away, just poured more coffee, because I needed him to see it for himself. Because love doesn't always mean stepping in. It sometimes means stepping back and letting someone fall, so they learn how to stand. One rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky just gives up and pours without warning, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. We were on the porch, under the overhang, watching the driveway fill with puddles. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the stores? The properties? All of it?" His voice was low, not angry, just hurt, confused. I turned to him, hands wrapped around my warm mug. "Because I wanted you to build your own life, not lean on mine." EY blinked, like the words didn't make sense at first. "But I worked so hard," he said, almost to himself. "I thought I had to, because you didn't have anything." "Exactly," I said gently. "That hunger, that drive, it made you who you are. Honest, responsible, grounded. If I'd handed you money or shown you my accounts, you might have rested. And I didn't want you to rest. I wanted you to rise." He looked down at his hands, calloused from years of work, and for the first time since he was a boy who skinned his knee falling off his bike, real tears spilled over. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet, heavy. Tears that ran down his cheeks and dropped onto his jeans. I didn't reach out, didn't say it's okay. I just sat with him in the rain and the silence, letting him feel the weight of what he'd lost and what he could rebuild. In the days that followed, the fog around him started to lift. He stopped, jumping at his phone every time it buzzed. He stopped staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. One morning, he asked if we could go to the bank, not to check balances or argue over statements, but to refinance his car loan, the one he'd taken out to impress Lauren. We sat in the lobby together, Him nervous. Me calm. I didn't speak for him, didn't take over. I just sat beside him while he explained his situation to the loan officer, his voice trembling at first, then steadying. When they offered him a lower rate, he turned to me, eyes wide with disbelief. It worked? I nodded. Because you asked. That afternoon, he called a therapist. I'd left the number on the fridge days before. No pressure, just an option. He dialed it while I washed dishes, his voice low but firm. Hi, I'd like to make an appointment. I think I've been not seeing things clearly. When he hung up, he leaned against the counter, and let out a breath like he'd been holding it for months. She twisted everything, he said. Made me think protecting you meant controlling you. I turned off the faucet. Now you know the difference. We didn't talk much about Lauren, not directly, but little by little, he started unraveling her. Influence. He blocked her on social media, deleted old messages. When she called twice, once crying, once demanding, he let it go to voicemail. She says I'm throwing away our future, he told me one evening, stirring pasta on the stove. What did you say? I asked. Nothing, he replied. Because our future was built on lies, and I don't want to live in a house with no foundation. He started making lists, boundaries, things he wouldn't tolerate, things he needed to protect. No more shared passwords. No more just signing this real quick. No more letting someone else define my love. I watched. Him as he wrote, hand steady, jaw set. This wasn't the son who'd smiled like a fool at Thanksgiving, proud of his own undoing. This was a man waking up, and I didn't give him money to ease the transition. Instead, I gave him something better. Belief. I believed he could rebuild without her, that he could raise his child without her poison, that he could trust himself again, even after being so thoroughly misled. By the end of the second week, the house felt different, lighter. He slept through the night. He laughed once, real laughter, when I burned the toast and cursed like his father used to. One morning, he came downstairs with his suitcase packed, not in a rush, but with quiet resolve. I'm moving into the apartment downtown, he said. The one near the park. 2 bedrooms, one for me, one for whenever. He didn't say for the baby, but I knew. He'd already started preparing, not for Lauren's return, but for his role as a father, on his own terms. I didn't offer to pay the deposit, didn't insist he stay longer. I just handed him a thermos of coffee and a container of oatmeal cookies. You've got everything you need, I said. He hugged me then, tight, the way he used to when he was small and scared. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. I should have trusted you. You didn't know, I said into his shoulder. Now you do. And that was enough. When he pulled out of the driveway, I stood on the porch, arms crossed against the morning chill. I watched his car disappear around the bend, not with sadness, but with a quiet pride I hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just my son again. He was whole. Not because I'd fixed him, but because he'd chosen to see clearly, to feel deeply, to rebuild with honesty instead of illusion. He'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that love shouldn't require surrender, and trust shouldn't mean blindness. And as I turned back toward the house I'd kept simple so he'd never take comfort for granted, I knew I'd done the one thing that mattered most. I'd raised a man who could stumble, fall, and still find his way home. Not to my money, to my truth. And that was the only inheritance I ever wanted to leave. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Ashland apothecary, catching dust motes dancing in the air as I dipped the label brush into deep green ink. Rosemary plus lemon. Clarity and calm, I wrote slowly, each stroke deliberate. The scent of dried herbs hung thick and sweet, lavender, thyme, sage, just like in my first little workshop over 30 years ago. Behind me, Maya and Jules laughed softly as they filled amber bottles with elderberry syrup. Both single moms, both juggling daycare pickups and rent payments, both working hard without apology. I'd hired them not just because they were skilled, but because I saw myself in them. The tired eyes, the quick hands, the quiet pride in earning their own way. I didn't give them charity. I gave them fair pay, steady hours, and respect. That's what I'd wanted all along. Not to be saved, but to be seen. The front bell chimed, and I looked up to see Daniel walking in with Scout trotting beside him, leash slack, tail wagging. He'd been coming every Sunday since the dust settled, usually with coffee in hand and that softer look in his eyes. The one that used to belong to the boy who built birdhouses with me in the garage. "Mom," he said, handing me a paper cup. "You forgot your usual." I smiled. "Thanks, honey." We didn't talk about the past much anymore. We didn't need to. We'd said what mattered in quiet moments over soup or during walks in the garden behind the shop. He'd started therapy, cut ties with Lauren's, manipulative calls, filed the final divorce papers himself. And every time he looked at me now, it was with clarity. Not confusion, not guilt, just love, unclouded. Lauren had filed for divorce 2 months after Christmas. Said she couldn't live under constant judgment. She'd moved to Nevada, lost. Vegas, of all places, where she told her family she was starting fresh. I heard through Daniel that she'd started working as a social media manager for a wellness brand, still spinning stories, still curating a life that looked perfect from the outside. I didn't check her profiles. Didn't want to. But I thought about her sometimes, not with anger, not even resentment, just a quiet sadness. She'd believed control was power, that taking over someone else's life would make her feel secure. But real security doesn't come from holding someone else's strings. It comes from standing on your own 2 feet. And in trying to clip my wings, she'd flown too close to the sun with wax wings of her own making. She lost everything. My son's trust, her place in this family, even the illusion of the life she'd built. I didn't rejoice in it. I just felt tired for her. Because dignity isn't something you take, it's something you carry. And she traded hers for a throne made of smoke. As I tied a neat twine bow around a gift box, rosemary oil, lavender salve, chamomile tea blend, all wrapped in brown paper, I realized I hadn't fought to prove I was wealthy. Not really. I'd fought to prove I was worthy of trust, of truth, of a seat at my own table. And now, standing in this sunlit room I'd built with my own hands, I finally felt it. I mattered. Not because of what I owned, but because of who I'd remained through it all. That afternoon, a woman came in with tired eyes and a baby strapped to her chest. She hesitated near the counter, glancing at the price tags like she was calculating whether she could afford even the smallest jar. I recognized that look instantly. The silent math of a mother who puts herself last. "Can I help you with something?" I asked gently. She nodded. "My baby's been teething. A friend said your chamomile glycerite helps." "It does," I said, and reached under the counter. "Try this sample. See how he takes it." She blinked, surprised. "Oh, I can pay—" "No," I said, pressing the small amber bottle into her hand. "Just bring me a smile next time you're in." She looked like she might cry. Instead, she smiled, a real one, and whispered, "Thank you." After she left, Maya caught my eye. "You do that every time, don't you?" I shrugged. When you've been there, you never forget how it feels. That's what this shop was really about. Not profit, not expansion, but connection. A place where women could walk in feeling invisible and leave feeling seen. Where healing wasn't just in the herbs, but in the exchange, the acknowledgement, the quiet understanding that no one should have to do it all alone. As I wiped down the counter, I thought about how far I'd come. Not just financially, but emotionally. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't apologizing for my strength. I was simply living it, one labeled jar, one honest conversation, one Sunday visit at a time. Daniel stayed later than usual that day. We sat in the back garden on weathered wooden chairs, Scout napping at our feet, the late afternoon sun warm on our faces. He stirred his coffee absently. "You know," he said after a while, "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing you. Not physically, but you, the real you." I didn't say anything, just let him speak. "I let her paint you as someone you weren't, and because I wanted so badly to be the good son, to protect you, I ended up doing the opposite." He looked at me then, eyes clear. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not just for believing her, but for not trusting you enough to ask." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You were trying to do the right thing, Daniel. That's what matters. And you fixed it. That matters even more." He nodded, and for a long moment we just sat in the quiet, listening to the wind rustle through the rosemary bushes. No grand declarations, no dramatic promises. Just two people who'd walked through fire, together and come out the other side, scarred but whole. And in that stillness, I felt something shift inside me. Not healing exactly, but settling. Like a house that's finally been put back on its foundation after an earthquake. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living, and on my own terms. I closed the shop early that day, locked the door, flipped the sign, and walked out into the golden light of late spring. The street was quiet, the usual afternoon bustle already fading. I didn't rush home. I took the long way, past the bookstore, the bakery, the little park where I used to push Daniel on the swings. Everything looked different now, not because the world had changed, but because I was seeing it clearly again. For years, I'd worn invisibility like armor. I thought humility meant silence, that love meant disappearing so others could shine. But real love doesn't require erasure. It requires presence. And I was done hiding. When I got home, I didn't check emails or review accounts. I went straight to my knitting basket, the one James had given me for our 5th anniversary, and pulled out soft, heather gray wool. No pattern this time, just needles clicking in rhythm, loop after loop, building something warm and whole from a single strand. I knit for myself, not for anyone else. No gift, no obligation, just this quiet act of creation, this reminder that my hands could still make something beautiful after all they'd been through. As the scarf grew longer in my lap, I thought about the woman I'd been at Thanksgiving, small, quiet, watching my own family celebrate my undoing. And I thought about who I was now, rooted, clear, unafraid. I didn't need their approval to exist. I never had. I just needed to remember that. By the time the scarf was long enough to wrap twice around my neck, the sun had set and the first stars were blinking awake. I held the finished piece in my hands, simple, sturdy, mine, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of alignment. I hadn't won by shouting or shaming or demanding restitution. I'd won by refusing to disappear, by showing up fully, for myself and for my son. Lauren had thought control was the ultimate power, but real power was the quiet certainty that your life belonged to you, that your worth wasn't up for debate, your truth wasn't negotiable, and your love wasn't conditional on pretending to be less than you were. As I folded the scarf and placed it on my dresser, I knew this chapter was closing, but my story wasn't over. It was just beginning, written in my own voice, stitched with my own hands, and lived on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. If this story moved you, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me and helps other women find these stories when they need them most. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, your name. I read every single one of you, and knowing I'm not alone in this journey keeps me going. Thank you, truly, for listening with your heart and for standing with me in truth and dignity. There are many more real, raw stories like this one waiting for you here, each one a testament to the strength we carry even when the world tries to silence us. With love, respect, and gratitude, I'll see you in the next one.